Buddy. Oops, thank you. Uh, Welcome everybody to the CSPAR, or the Center for Suicide Prevention and Recovery Spotlight Series. We do these presentations every month on Thursdays at 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern, and that makes it what, 11 Central? I don't want to leave Central out. Um, uh, we are happy to welcome one of our own, Joey Cheung, to present today. But before that, just want a few announcements. One is, if you hadn't heard, the Suicide Care Research Center, our P50 NIMH grant, did finally get its funding for 2025. So we are super happy to have all of the members of our team back at work with us and are trying to catch up as fast as we can. Thank you. We have also our suicide care trainings are coming up the week of Suicide Prevention Day, so the 8th and the 10th. They are training focused on general suicide care that meets the Washington State criteria for required suicide assessment, management, and treatment for licensing. And we also offer CME for this training. So link is in the chat if you're interested. We did a community mental health specific version of this, which is now up online on our website. For $65. You can review it, and it also meets all of the required training for licensure, but focused in a community mental health environment in particular. And at this time next month, we will have a presentation, and we're very excited at long last to be presenting on our study of Google search data as a predictor of suicide risk, and kind of how our study actually turned out. It's a lot more complicated doing tech research than I think we ever knew when we got into it. So if you that'll be September 18th. We'd love to have people come for that. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Joey Cheung. She's currently a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford Medicine, specializing in dialectical behavior therapy and addiction medicine. Dr. Cheung's research focuses on examining static and dynamic facets of emotion dysregulation that facilitate self-injurious thoughts and behaviors. And she's very interested in developing and evaluating digital mental health interventions for high-risk populations. And this project was a good example of this, that she was awarded a clinical scientist training program trainee research award during her predoctoral internship here at the University of Washington with me to do this pilot study. Prior to that, she received her PhD in clinical psychology at Temple University, and moved to the internship with us, and is now at Stanford, and will be finishing up and kind of moving on to her new life in post-training world pretty soon. So Joey, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks so much for that wonderful introduction, Kate. Gonna go ahead and share my screen. And welcome. I'm incredibly excited to be here today and have an opportunity to share some of those preliminary results from an intervention that we designed and tested at CSPAR, an intervention that aimed at examining the use of ecological momentary assessment, or EMA, techniques to increase use of mindfulness as a way of addressing NSSI, or non-suicidal self-injury. So before I dive into the talk, I wanted to celebrate some people and just share my gratitude and acknowledge that this project absolutely would not have been possible without my mentor, Dr. Kate Comtois, my wonderful research scientists, Peyton, Annie, and Anna, who helped implement and run the study when I was knee-deep working on my dissertation and finishing up internship, as well as an incredible team here at CSPAR that provided invaluable support and feedback as we were developing this treatment. The study is also funded by the University of Washington School of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences Clinical Scientist Training Program, which is a mouthful, but I'm very grateful for their funding to allow us to kind of do this research. I also wanted to take a moment to share my gratitude for the participants who shared their experience to give us a better understanding of ways we can improve digital interventions for this population, as well as acknowledge and honor the significance of Indigenous lands that we're gathering on today, regardless of where we're calling in from. All right, getting into the content. So, non-suicidal self-injury, or NSSI, is an act of intentional and direct harm to one's body tissue without the intent to die. Not only is it a pervasive public health problem, but has also been found to be one of the most robust predictors of recurrent hospitalization and future suicidal behaviors. Although this behavior itself has been historically seen as part of the diagnostic picture for borderline personality disorder, it has been explored as a diagnosis on its own, but it's also now being considered a transdiagnostic feature to be added on and used to modify other psychological diagnoses. NSSI has been largely tied with emotion dysregulation, considering it both a risk factor and a function of the behavior. But we also might think about how poor distress tolerance, executive functioning, as well as rumination are additional vulnerability factors that have been associated with NSSI, which might also lead to increased difficulty with general adaptive skill building and habit formation. And so when we think about NSSI, one of the more prominent theories is the emotional cascade model, which was proposed by Dr. Ed Selby and Thomas Joyner in 2009. And what they posited was that certain individuals have a greater predisposition for negative affect and are maybe more likely or prone to ruminate. Rumination being a recurrent, perseverative, and passive thinking about your feelings or your problems. When these individuals experience an emotional stimuli, it activates a heightened emotional response due to that emotional sensitivity, which that sets off the perseveration over the negative stimuli, and then the two kind of ping pong off of each other, building up emotional distress in a process known as the emotional cascade. So the emotional cascade model argues that NSSI serves as a behavioral form of emotion regulation that disrupts the distress cycle by distracting your attention away from the rumination onto something more potent, the more potent physical sensations generated by NSSI. And then the disruption of this distress cycle provides emotional relief, decreases that negative affect pretty rapidly, which then subsequently negatively reinforces this behavior as a form of emotion regulation. So with this whole model in mind, the interventions for NSSI would really benefit from disrupting the emotional cascade earlier upstream in the chain, whether that's by tackling that emotional sensitivity or rumination. And so this is where mindfulness comes in as a potentially interesting and effective intervention target, as it has both impacts on emotion dysregulation and rumination. Mindfulness, or the intentional, non-judgmental open awareness of internal and external stimuli, is both this core skill in dialectical behavioral therapy, which is the gold standard treatment for suicide and self-harm behaviors, but it's also a key component in cognitive behavioral treatments targeting rumination. Moreover, mindfulness might also be an interesting intervention target given the recent proliferation of digital mindfulness interventions. I'm sure you've heard of plenty of these examples, ranging from Calm, Headspace, Insight Timer, or even associated with the health app that's available on your wearable devices. Digital mindfulness interventions could also be an interesting opportunity because there's an increased potential of educating other folks about mindfulness through a way that's more accessible using their phones, making a daily practice easier, and lowering barriers for entry, whether that's financially or geographically. In particular, thinking about this population who engage in NSSI, those who tend to seek help online compared to those who are seeking professional services in person or virtually, kind of via telehealth, have reported more severe NSSI frequency and intensity, suggesting that there might be a particular need for digital populations in treating NSSI. And if you've ever used one of these digital mindfulness apps, you might have noticed that many of them have built in some version of a notification system to remind you to practice or have included some check-in questions, which is actually somewhat similar to what ecological momentary assessment is, or in other words, receiving multiple alerts throughout the day asking you questions about what is happening right now in the moment. And in the realm of NSSI research, EMA has been used as a tool for understanding proximal risk and trying to predict NSSI urges and behaviors using real-time data collection. And sort of there's this camp of research that's focusing on the assessment side of things, which is really looking at predictions and trends. And there's also this dimension of ecological momentary interventions, which are really oriented towards delivering just-in-time interventions as either prompted by what folks are responding to in the EMA assessments or based on passive monitoring data. And so these interventions are really intended for high-risk scenarios in which participants might be responding or saying something is kind of activating increased risk for engaging in NSSI and then delivering an intervention. But the question that I had was whether or not answering the check-in questions themselves, could they be the intervention? And if so, how can we make this sort of self-reflective check-in process effective for reinforcing adaptive behaviors like mindfulness? With that in mind, we sought to create an intervention that utilizes EMA to reinforce habit building with the intention of trying to increase use of digital mindfulness interventions, particularly among individuals who are engaging in NSSI. So based on recommendations and frameworks for piloting interventions, we conducted our study in 2 phases, with phase 1 aiming to develop the treatment and phase 2 being to evaluate it. So the treatment development was we really focused on building this EMA habit formation type strategy, using a lot of evidence-based frameworks, so pulling from dialectical behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, and language around values, goals, as well as that contingency management behavioral strategies that are pulled from dialectical behavioral therapy. In terms of our treatment evaluation aim, we really wanted to largely assess the feasibility, effectiveness, and usability of the intervention itself, understanding whether EMA measures of NSSI could be comparable to any self-report measures that we're using, and then to also identify further feedback, both quantitatively and qualitatively, for the next iteration of this intervention. So what do we do? Taking all of this into account, let's dive in. As mentioned, our study was executed in 2 phases, with phase 1 really focused on the treatment development using as case series. And so for phase 1, we prioritized qualitative and quantitative feedback from participants to inform ways that we can increase the effectiveness and usability of the interventions. And we recruited participants who completed past NSSI EMA studies because we could rely on them for having high completion rates and knowing that they had engaged in current NSSI. With all of this data collected, we then integrated that into a redesign process where we modified the intervention. And here listed some of the main changes that we made. I wanted to highlight that we did switch our intervention app from Calm to Smiling Mind, included a mood check question that a lot of participants wanted in the intervention EMA, and then gave more prompts and psychoeducation to tie values and goals with mindfulness and NSSI. We then piloted this updated intervention in phase 2, where we recruited participants from the community that we randomized into 2 groups with the aim of evaluating the acceptability, effectiveness, and feasibility of the intervention. So the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to focus on the phase 2 study design and presenting these results. So our entire study was actually delivered through REDCap, using Inclivio for our EMA delivery system, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But all of our data collection was done via REDCap, so a very low kind of cost way of creating the intervention. All of our participants in our phase 2 were recruited through Prolific, which is an online participant recruitment platform. And we essentially sent them all a screening survey that captured our inclusion criteria, which largely meant you had to be an adult, you had to be based in the US, you have to be engaging in current NSSI as defined by having 1 act of NSSI in the last month and 5 acts in the last year, as well as having a smartphone that you're willing to utilize for downloading a digital mindfulness app. After participants are screened, all participants came in for a pre-assessment or baseline survey. During the survey, we assessed for general demographics, their mental health history, treatment history, comfortability and use of technology, their general mindfulness practice, either current or in the past, as well as providing some psychoeducation, and around what mindfulness is, the types of mindfulness practices there are available out there, what is Smiling Mind as the app that they're going to use for the duration of the 6 weeks, as well as an orientation to daily check-ins. giving you a little bit of context for the app that we chose. So we switched over from Calm to Smiling Mind because a big piece of feedback that we got from phase one was that participants didn't like the paywall aspect of Calm. And so we chose Smiling Mind because it was an evidence-based app that was well researched and actually created by a research group in Australia. They had a lot of different types of programs for age groups or for parents or for teachers or for students and kids. They also had a range of different mindfulness practices that we liked, giving our participants a lot of variability. There was an option to have a structured directed program, so you didn't have to pick or just figure out which mindfulness practice you want every day, or you could also design your own and choose your own adventure. And generally speaking, the app was sort of well rated by OneMind, and so we thought it was a good opportunity to try it out. So all of our participants were instructed after the pre-assessment that they could start using Smiling Mind. They were encouraged to start using it and start developing that mindfulness practice. And then we invited all of our participants into the first week of their assessment EMA. And I'll go into details about the questions at a later slide. But essentially, all of our participants did an assessment EMA. Then for our control group, they were told to just hang tight, use the apps as they would, live their life, and we would check in with them after about 4 weeks. For our folks who are in the treatment condition, we then guided them through a goal-setting intervention, which really had the aim of kind of anchoring any mindfulness practice or reduction in NSSI based on their values and goals, pulling from this acceptance and commitment therapy framework. So borrowing from a lot of the skills and techniques that are used in ACT, we first had our participants go through a values identification task where they kind of rated a bunch of different values as very important, important, and not so important. And then we pulled those identified very important values and then brought them into step two, where we asked our participants to rank their top five, the five that are most important to them. Using those values, we then ask participants to reflect on how these values are linked with their desire to reduce NSSI, as well as their desire to potentially increase mindfulness. And so we had folks write in these open-ended prompts as sort of a general reflection, but also gave them more of these multiple choice type questions to kind of encourage different ways of reflection and drawing connection. After we kind of did all those links between values and their sort of behaviors, we then moved into specific goal setting. And so we guided our participants through the SMART goal criteria and then asked them to create their own SMART goals relating to mindfulness or reducing their NSSI. After our participants wrote their own SMART goals, we then guided them to kind of rate their own and judge their own goals that they set about whether or not they fit the SMART goal criteria. If they found or thought that it didn't fit the SMART goal criteria, they were given 2 extra prompts to potentially re-edit or re-attempts to kind of re-edit those goals. But if they thought it was great, then they would be able to move on to writing their long-term goal. So we asked all participants to design a short-term goal as well as a long-term goal intended for the next week and then sort of for the duration of the study. After our participants did this goal-setting intervention in the treatment group, they were then directed into doing 4 weeks of the intervention EMA. And so during this 4-week period, they would receive daily EMA alerts, as well as get a weekly summary email that captured the number of EMA they completed that week, as well as a reminder of their goals that they set at the goal-setting intervention. At the end of that 4-week period, we had all of our participants come back for the assessment EMA period, which mirrored the first week of EMA that they completed. And then finally, at the end of all 6 of those weeks, we had our participants complete a post-assessment, which is where we gathered most of our acceptability and feasibility feedback. Diving into what those EMA questions were specifically, we wanted to kind of separate what our assessment EMA questions were going to be and our intervention EMA because they were intended to do different things. So for our assessment questions, they were really aimed at evaluating the different components of the emotional cascade model to look for trends in rumination, affect, and non-suicidal self-injury. And this is intended to see like if our intervention would have indeed the effect of disrupting the emotional cascade in some way. And then our intervention EMA, though, was designed to really help encourage our participants to reflect on their mindfulness practice, check in with their current state of mindfulness, and give us feedback about whether or not they did have a mindfulness practice or they used the Smiling Mind app. We also added a single item open-ended mood check question for participants because they were requesting that through the treatment development phase, but we only made it a one question, one item addition because we wanted to lower participant burden. All of our EMA was delivered through Inclivio, which is this wonderful platform that was designed by one of our colleagues here at the University of Washington. And all of our participants would receive 3 EMA alerts daily at random times over the course of 6 weeks. So for our control group, they would receive them consistently for 2 weeks at week 1 and week 6, leading to a total of 42 alerts. But our treatment group would get it consistently throughout the 6 weeks. So that was a total of 126 alerts we would have gathered from them. All of the alerts had a 1-hour response limit, and participants would receive a reminder after 15 minutes if they haven't responded to the initial prompt, and they were delivered within the 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. time period. And here's just the general EMA payment schedule that we followed, which is consistent with what other EMA studies conducted at CSPAR, as well as sort of in the general zeitgeist of NSSI research. So looking at our participant breakdown, here are our participants in both the pilot study or in the, sorry to say the pilot study, I meant the treatment development phase, as well as our control and treatment groups, largely focusing on folks that are actually in the pilot phase or phase 2 of our study. There was actually no significant difference between our 2 groups with the exception of self-identified gender. And in our control group, we had more participants who self-identified as male compared to our treatment condition. So just something to note moving forward. All right, so that was a lot about the complexity of the treatment and also of the study design, leading into talking about some results. So the results I'll be presenting today are really focused on that aim 2 and going through the treatment evaluation sub-aims. For evaluation purposes, we asked our participants to consider the digital mindfulness app, so Smiling Mind, the assessment EMA, the goal-setting intervention, the intervention EMA, as well as the weekly check-in emails as sort of like the full package or the system to evaluate, with participants in the control condition only providing us feedback on the app and the assessment EMA portion, and then our folks in the treatment group giving us feedback on the whole thing. So when we're looking at our system usability scores, participants in both conditions scored above the 70, which is great because that is passing the threshold for system usability and acceptability. And there was no significant difference between our 2 conditions, which is also fantastic because it suggests that the elements that we created and added onto the study wasn't aversive to participants. And actually, overall, we got qualitative feedback saying that the study in general felt really helpful in terms of developing emotional awareness and really helpful kind of helping people reflect and understand what was going on for them internally. And the quotes underneath in italics are just some example quotes that we got from qualitative feedback from the participants. We also wanted to see and test out and wondered if there was going to be any difference in outcomes between the control and the treatment groups, which unfortunately we did not find any main or interaction effects between the treatment groups pre-post intervention. So whether that's in substance use, depression, anxiety, PTSD scores, resilience, rumination, mindfulness, problem solving, coping, things like that, kind of didn't see any treatment effects across the board. We also wanted to see if this was the case in terms of our assessment EMA, and we similarly did not find any main or significant interaction effects between the treatment groups looking at the pre-assessment EMA as well as the post-assessment EMA. There was an exception with positive affect, such that participants in the treatment group observed an overall increase in their positive affect compared to participants in the control group, where there was a slight decrease, suggesting that maybe our intervention was helpful in terms of increasing positive affect in some way. But again, very preliminary. Okay, so now breaking down the different elements of the intervention and mapping them onto our phase 2 sub-aims as a way of kind of organizing our results. So the first question I wanted to look at was the retention rates for the 6 weeks of EMA. In total, we collected 2,124 observations across both conditions. However, 24 cases were dropped because 3 of the participants were removed from the final sample as they only responded to fewer than 10% of the EMA responses. So that would be 4 alerts for the control group and 15 alerts for the treatment group. And we decided to drop their cases because of how few responses they gave, which basically rendered their data unusable in terms of the larger analytic sample, leaving us with a final analytic sample of 2,210 observations. And here's just the general breakdown of how many of those observations came from the treatment group versus the control group. So on average, we got a average 32.47 responses from our control group out of 42 alerts that they could have possibly completed, leading to an average compliance rate of 77.282%, with 14% or 14 participants out of the 19 completing 80% or more of the EMA alerts. For our treatment group, they on average responded to about 96 EMA alerts, which gave us a compliance rate of 65.39%. They could have responded to a total of 146 alerts, and only about 50% of our treatment condition responded to 80% or more of the EMA alerts across the 6 weeks, which is somewhat expected as we would see decreases in using our responding to the NSSI or the EMA responses when there's a longer time period. Giving a little bit of a visual representation of that data. The red line here represents the full sample, and the purple line represents our final analytic sample, so after we drop those cases. And as you can see here, we're generally looking at a compliance rate ranging from about 60 to 80%, which is pretty typical for our population. And we're seeing these general trends downward as time goes on, which again is also kind of expected. Down here in these 2 graphs and looking at the number of participants who completed each alert across the pre-post period, we could also see that each alert had about 80% of participants completing that alert. There is this observation that there was a slight dip in alert responses in the middle of the study for the treatment group for some reason, but generally speaking, we're seeing pretty consistent response rates for alerts across the pre-post period as well. Okay, so all of that's kind of indicating that the 6-week EMA period was relatively manageable for participants and that they liked it. And so now moving on to our second sub-aim, looking at the feasibility, effectiveness, and usability of the NSSI EMA measures. And what we wanted to really examine here was whether or not our EMA self-report, our EMA NSSI frequency measures would map onto our self-reports. And so what we found here was that there was really no significant difference between our EMA results as well as our self-report results, with the exception of interfering with wound healing, being participants that reported doing this more compared to when in their EMA. Surprisingly, we also didn't find a lot of correlation between the EMA and the self-report, and so there's some hypotheses that can be made there. One thing that I was noticing that there's generally a higher reported rate in the self-report compared to the EMA, which could either be due to an overinflation in that retrospective reflection, or because due to their being missing alerts from the EMA time period. Now moving on to some of the more meaty stuff, which is looking at whether or not mindfulness practice and using the app actually had any impact on NSSI. Giving you some descriptives of just general mindfulness practices during the treatment EMA period. Out of the 1,005 treatment EMA responses received, participants reported in about 26% of those EMA alerts that they engaged in some degree of a mindfulness practice since their last alert. And of those practices, 39.23% were actually based on using the Smiling Mind app. So below here is a graph that you can see where each participant kind of reports their use of mindfulness. And that top line is whether or not they did practice mindfulness, and the bottom line is them saying no. And as you can see, most participants did at least engage in mindfulness at least once for the duration of the study, with the exception of this participant and this participant. And here is a breakdown of the types of practices folks practiced during the treatment EMA period, with breathing being the most prominent, followed by a mindful activity. What we found is that there was an increased probability of participants practicing mindfulness later in the day, which makes sense. They were able to reflect on a mindfulness practice for a longer duration throughout the day, so that kind of tracks. But what we also found is that the mindfulness practice did increase over the course of the study, or over the course of the treatment EMA period, suggesting that there was some degree of habit building that was happening here. And we also found that average levels of mindfulness ratings captured in the treatment EMA did predict to decreases in total NSSI frequency and NSSI urge. This carried over to when we were looking at state mindfulness scores, suggesting that higher state mindfulness predicted lower likelihood of NSSI presence at the next alert, as well as decreased NSSI frequency. And here's the graphical representation of that data, which is really exciting because this is the first time we've ever looked at whether mindfulness scores did in fact have some sort of preventive effect on NSSI predictions in the future. However, this did not translate to a mindfulness practice, so that we did not find any significant effect between whether a participant practiced mindfulness in predicting their NSSI presence, frequency, or urge strength at the next alert. In fact, we actually did not find any evidence that supported our mindfulness score was relating to their mindfulness practice, such that mindfulness scores did not predict whether they were going to engage in mindfulness in the next alert, and their mindfulness practice did not predict to higher mindfulness scores at the next alert either. So there's really the question about why those two things were not associated. Okay, so that's more of the sort of like quantitative side of things, understanding what was going on and did we have a treatment effect. Then looking at our sub-aims 4 and 5, which is where I'm going to pull from a lot of the quantitative and qualitative feedback from the acceptability and feasibility survey that we collected during the post assessment. And here I'm focusing on the intervention EMA, the goal setting intervention, as well as those weekly check-in emails. So looking at intervention EMA first, we also wanted to see how participants would respond to EMA overall, and in general, particularly looking at the treatment group, which is represented in this darker color, folks tended to find the EMA in general relatively acceptable, suitable, and feasible, with a lot of comments and themes emerging about liking that it was consistent, liking that there was an emotional reflection and building awareness, and that they were short. But the most consistent feedback that we also got was that they didn't like the randomness and the inconvenience of having to fill out the EMA alerts during times when they might be busy or at work or sleeping, and wanting to be able to customize the responses and having a longer response window. As we're diving into specifically looking at the intervention EMA, we see similar trends of finding it acceptable, suitable, as well as feasible. And we had some similar kind of like likes of the intervention EMA, given that it was accountability, consistency, short, and reflections. But there were also dislikes that were the same. So the timing, wanting a longer response window. But the one thing that stands out to me is that there was this naming of increased pressure or stress for not having responded to the intervention EMA. And in fact, seeing this quote, participants were feeling guilty when they said no to doing the mindfulness practice, which might have prompted them to actually skip the next alert. So we wanted to dive into this a little bit more, and what we saw was that participants in both the control group as well as the treatment group reported feeling guilty for missing a response of the daily check-ins, and that particularly for the treatment groups, they also felt guilty when they didn't practice mindfulness before the mindfulness check-in. However, based on those participants' reports, the majority of them say that that didn't dissuade them from actually filling in a mindfulness check-in, but there was a subgroup of participants that did say this was highly influential in them missing the next check-in alert. Something considering about guilt playing a role into all of this. We also asked our participants to compare our assessment EMA with their intervention EMA to see if it was acceptable and whether they liked it or which one was more helpful. And what we found is that for our intervention EMA, it stands out as being more engaging, although participants found both to be self-reflective and engaging as well. But that's also interesting because our participants also found the intervention EMA to be more annoying, burdensome, and guilt-inducing, which I'm hypothesizing has potentially something to do with the duration of this study and having to fill out many more EMA alerts. However, that's just a hypothesis and something that we need to probe into further. And looking at the improvements that were suggested for the intervention EMA, the majority of participants really wanted us to have some degree of a direct link from the survey to the app itself. So kind of mimicking a little bit of that ecological momentary intervention type, so kind of that just-in-time intervention type aspect of it. But other improvement suggestions were having a longer response window, being able to personalize their alert times, less repetition, so giving some diversity in terms of the questions being asked, more mindfulness questions and less NSSI questions because they wanted to focus on building that practice rather than feeling bad about, having engaged in NSSI or asking to think about that frequently. So moving on to our goal setting intervention feedback. We generally, again, found that it was acceptable, suitable, and feasible for most participants. So it sounded like that it was actually quite okay for a lot of our folks. And they found that the SMART goals step was the one that was most liked, most helpful, and most likely to be used again. I also wanted to point out that for our values exercises, a lot of our participants named liking it, especially in the qualitative feedback, but there's something interesting that's happening here that they didn't find it as helpful or likely to use again, which might be related to some of the feedback they're giving us about why the values identification and clarification task was a little confusing. So what they said here for improvement specifically was asking for us to rearrange the values list by theme or kind of presenting it in a less onerous way at the beginning of the study so that they could actually access it better and having clearer instructions. The themes that we gathered were that participants really liked that it was customizable, editable, they could include their own values, and they liked having a lot of variability in terms of how they responded to it, and that they also gave us feedback that the instructions were really clear in terms of translating values into goals. And that was one of our main concerns, is that we wanted to know whether or not it's actually helpful for participants to reflect on mindfulness and reflect on why they would want to do it, as well as reflecting on how NSSI might be getting in the way of their values. And based on those quantitative responses, we can see that most participants actually really liked this step and found that this was generally something that was helpful. Moving on to the SMART goals, our participants really liked that there was a self-empowerment and a self-directedness to the steps, and that they were able to anchor these sort of more abstract ideas and values onto something that was very current and something that they could actively work on. Um, we also saw a subgroup of our participants who didn't really like it because they had difficulty coming up with specific goals, or that they've done SMART goals before, they've heard of them before, felt like an assignment and was kind of cumbersome. Um, so taking those pieces in mind, some of the improvements that were suggested to us was wanting a little bit more psychoeducation, talking specifically about how the short-term goal might be in support of their long-term goal and drawing those connections, giving more gentle and frequent reminders of the goals throughout the study, but also providing them some suggestions and some easy to fill out templates, particularly for those participants who had some difficulty coming up with goals themselves. And last but not least, to talk about those weekly check-in emails. This is really where I think participants felt the most about all of it. And as represented by kind of this rating and frequency data here, that they were kind of in the middle about how the weekly check-in emails were. We received sort of qualitative feedback following the themes that, the frequency of the emails was just about right, that they contained a little bit encouraging type information, but most folks actually didn't find it particularly helpful, whether that was because they were missing email reminders completely and gone to spam or something like that, or they found that the content wasn't really motivating, or the content was actually getting buried in the email and they weren't reading through it. So we got a lot of feedback saying that we actually didn't tell them how many EMA alerts they completed, or that we didn't remind them of goals, which was not necessarily accurate. So it makes us think of whether or not folks are actually reading through the emails. Um, and so just wanting to share some of the quotes that were also included in that qualitative feedback. When asking participants, like, what can we improve in terms of these weekly check-in emails, a lot of folks actually made some mention of a trend report. So wanting some way to track their progress or know what their progress is, or getting feedback on their progress. And when we did a deeper dive on some of those themes, what we found is folks really wanted some progress tracker relating to their goals, or in looking at their mood trends. So being able to see statistics about different emotions that they might be feeling, if there are trends about during certain parts of the day or times of the day, and being able to use that as a way to prompt them to remind themselves of engaging in mindfulness. And so again, this idea that participants really want feedback and really want some data and understanding how we're collecting all of this information and finding that interesting. Um, And last but not least, for our sixth sub-aim was to really identify barriers for digital mindfulness intervention use. And this comes in the form of feedback that we got about the Smiling Mind app. Um, and in general, we saw that participants really enjoyed the Smiling Mind app. They thought it was acceptable, suitable, and feasible, particularly our folks in the treatment group, as represented by the darker bar. So indicating that this was something that was favorable to our participants. And generally, we got feedback saying that they liked that it was free, they liked that it was easy to use, and the variety of tools that were really offered. But we also saw another camp of participants who really disliked it. They thought the exercises were annoying and they didn't, really gel with using the app, which kind of gives me a little pause for thought and thinking that perhaps all apps are not designed for everyone and not everyone's going to like every single app, potentially offering more options during future iterations of this study. So what can we take away from all of our feedback that we got looking at this pilot study? So with sub-aim 1, we found that there was sustained EMA completion rates across the 6 weeks with expected level of attrition. More anecdotally, a lot of our participants gave feedback saying that the 6 weeks were perfectly reasonable. They found it helpful for building a consistency in practice, and they thought that it was sort of just the right amount of time. We also received feedback saying that they enjoyed getting 3 alerts throughout the day and they didn't want more or less. In terms of feasibility and effectiveness of our NSSI EMA measures, we found no significant difference between the EMA and self-report measures of NSSI, with some potential observational things suggesting that there was slight over-reporting in NSSI frequency in the self-report, but it's also unclear if this was due to missing EMA alerts and just not capturing all of the amounts of time they engaged in NSSI throughout the course of the study. And then lastly, in terms of our treatment effects, we did find that our participants practiced mindfulness even without the app, which was helpful, that there was a general increase in mindfulness over the course of the study and later in the day, but not necessarily associated with having an intentional mindfulness practice, so that mindfulness scores increase without increasing their engagement of it. An increased overall mindfulness and momentary mindfulness predicted decreases in NSSI frequency and or urges, which is a really exciting finding because so much of what the work has been is focused on rumination and not sort of the more protective version or the alternative to that. Then looking at our sub-aims 4 and 5, which is really where the qualitative and feedback steps come in when it comes to the treatment, what we found is that a lot of our participants had minimal differences between 2 versions of EMA, and they generally liked it. And they actually found the check-ins really helpful for self-reflection, awareness, and developing a consistency in practice. That our participants really enjoyed the goal setting aspect of it, and it helped develop a sense of purpose in continuing the study. They wanted more reminders and connection back to the values during the EMA for motivation. And so even amplifying some of the ways that we can pull in the findings we get from the goal setting and what participants named as part of their motivation throughout the duration of the study. And I think the most interesting and the most kind of like fun thing to get out of this study was this idea that participants really want data and they really want an idea to learn about their progress. That the most consistent feedback we got was that participants wanted more frequent feedback on their trends and having visual representation of those trends as a way to both motivate them and to also kind of help them better learn and develop awareness of their own self-harm uses and mindfulness practices, which then comes to next steps and really wanting to explore what it is that can make EMA a motivating thing. So far in this field, we've really thought about compensation as being the main incentivizer, but some of our results and the feedback that we got from participants are making me think whether information and progress tracking and things like that could actually be incentivizing in of themselves, and what type of data feedback or trend reports would participants want to see in order for that to really click in. There's also a lot of rich data that hasn't been explored yet in terms of the qualitative themes that have emerged through the goal setting intervention portion of the study. So really looking at what are the values that are being endorsed in the values identification and clarification task, really combing through the writing prompts that participants have used to connect their values with mindfulness and with NSSI, and then looking at what they're putting as their short-term and long-term goals to kind of see how those themes might be related to whether or not they had stronger likelihood or less likelihood of practicing mindfulness and reducing their NSSI. There's also an interesting question about tracking the mood effects during the intervention EMA and kind of looking at shame or guilt as a potential interfering behavior that might be predicting to less likelihood of using the EMA or kind of less likelihood of practicing mindfulness at the next alert. And then lastly, doing more A/B testing of the psychoeducation, of the information, changing up some of the formatting and content that we have provided for participants. Um, yeah, so those are some of the steps that I've thought about, and there's definitely a lot more that can be done with the amount of data that we collected. And so I wanted to thank you all for your time and for listening and for being interested in this study. I'm happy to take any questions at this time. I also have some discussion prompts if those would be helpful. Um, Kate, you're muted. Yeah.
Sorry. Maybe we could kick it off, see if people have any comments or questions that they have right off the bat. And if not, let's maybe move to some discussion points. But let me give a little space to see if people have comments or questions.
Joey, great job with this presentation and this project. It was so fun seeing kind of like when you first started designing it to kind of completion now with all of the results. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, and as we're working on EMAs and thinking about how they also serve as interventions, is how does this differ from like a traditional like EMI model of intervention delivery? And kind of what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is the thing that I've been mulling over quite a bit. And so historically, when we're looking, at least in the literature right now, when it comes to EMI, it's that participants either respond to a message saying that they have a high urge to engage in NSSI, or there's some other prompter or some other kind of like marker, biomarker, or movement marker, or text marker, or something like that that indicates predicted higher risk of engaging in a self-harm behavior, and that's the thing that triggers the intervention. So having that be like a high risk scenario and then being able to say like, hey, you should engage in, a skill right now, you should do a mindfulness practice. And I think that there's something about it being like a high risk scenario and using a prompt then to then ask folks to engage in a skill might actually reduce the likelihood of building the habit more as a consistency basis through a day-to-day practice rather than just being like a high risk thing. And particularly for mindfulness, of course, it can be helpful for grounding in those more acute scenarios, but generally it's a practice that needs to be developed during the less acute times as well in order for it to be useful during the more acute times. And so this is where I'm thinking about how this assessment piece might actually have an intervention component to it, less so for those like high risk scenarios, but more as a general, like, how do we make skills use more like usable throughout the day to day and not necessarily prompting it as an intervention um, through those moments. I hope that makes sense. I can elaborate further too.
Yeah, because something I'm interested that's I think was really interesting here, right? Is that you really could position this as like a new way of doing EMI
Mhm.
versus the traditional like just in time model because there's still an intervention going on here, which makes it like and a lot of your questions are meant to be kind of like changing behavior and whatnot.
Mhm.
I think it would be really cool to position this as like a new form of EMI that maybe folks haven't considered before.
Yeah, that's kind of really where I'm coming at this and the origins of this intervention and just even thinking about, I think there's been more anecdotally among the research community talking about like, is there an effect that comes with answering EMA responses? And there's actually been no studies that have looked at that. And so that's sort of the origins of this and thinking about whether instead of there being two camps of an EMA and an EMI, is there some middle ground there and where
Mhm.
would this land as an intervention itself?
Yeah. And I think for the feedback stuff, you should talk to Megan Rogers, and I'm happy to connect the two of you because she's been working on some like feedback stuff in a similar vein with EMA and whatnot. And so it'd be really interesting to kind of have you two in a symposium at some point, maybe at SRS next year.
Yeah,
Uh, but yeah.
that would be super cool.
Other questions, comments?
Were you assessing the guilt questions at the beginning, or did you add that like because of your responses you were seeing?
We didn't include it in phase one of our study, but we saw that there was sort of a lower response rate in phase one compared to our like these participants in previous studies. And so that was one of the questions and curiosities that we had was like, is guilt playing a role in this? Like, what is it that's making it actually hard for people to respond to EMA responses? We historically just predicted that it was like, oh, they were bored, they kind of ignored it, it wasn't interesting enough. But it was this kind of curious question that we had is like, is guilt playing a role? And so we included it as part of our feedback for our pilot study, which is where a lot of that data was coming from.
Yeah, excellent addition because as soon as you said it, my ears perked up because we've gotten just a lot of emails from people just saying, "Oh, I'm so sorry I missed a survey." And it's like, it's really not a big deal. That's why we ask you 3 times a day. But yeah, I
Yeah.
obviously just a lot of anxiety it seems going on, but
And
yeah.
that was something, that's a great question, Barbara, because like this was something that um, Peyton and Annie and I were really mulling over, which is like, how much can you reassure participants that it is okay? And is there something inherent about working with potentially a population that's a little bit more emotionally sensitive, that no matter how much reassurance we give folks, they're still going to have that pang of guilt for not filling it up. And so is there something that needs to be particular designed in this intervention to target that guilt as well is kind of the other piece that I'm thinking about, and not just kind of like giving reassurance, telling people it's okay, but actually building it as part of like a cope ahead when we're doing a goal setting or like kind of anticipating for participants like this might come up. How might you respond to this later on?
It's a really good idea and good insight to gather that. Thank you.
Yeah, I find it so interesting the parallel between engaging in a behavior, or in this case, absence of a behavior, feeling guilty about it, and persisting, as we can see in the percentages who got to 80% of completing their. But the same plays out with their NSSI,
Hmm.
right? So it's kind of an interesting, and the same thing plays out for people who are trying to implement a mindfulness practice. And it almost makes me think, if you could figure out how to do these trend lines, is there a way of doing it that highlights success instead of highlighting what they didn't do, which they can feel when they know they had a ping and they didn't respond to it. But like, in thinking about that weekly check-in or other things that could happen to say, hey, we noticed this thing going in a positive direction, would that change people's experience?
Yeah, and that was a question I had for the intervention EMA too, was like, did we actually want to ask folks about their NSSI, right? And if the goal of the intervention EMA is just to kind of get folks to be prompted, like, did you do your practice? What is your state right now? Kind of prompting that reflection. The NSSI piece really isn't necessary, but in terms of a research question here, there was something really compelling about wanting to see if those two things were tied and being it part of the like outcomes that we're interested in. And so there was a little bit of a tension here of like really wanting to like focus on maybe enhancing the positives as a motivation factor, with like this being a sort of a discovery piece of even knowing whether mindfulness is going to predict reduction in NSSI. So that was a part of the design piece that we kind of wrestled with. So moving forward, definitely wanting to think about what are the components that make the intervention actually helpful rather than being it kind of muddied in this like assessment intervention realm.
Well, I'm aware that we're going to have people hit the 10 o'clock hour, and I really did want a moment to say thank you for doing this. And I'm sure I will make sure that the link to this gets over to the clinical training program so that they can see, like, this is really, I think, exactly what they hope that you all can get out of this experience, is that chance to really have a little support to do a study that allows you to do a lot of thinking about this, and how much you've been able to get the opinions of the participants in this, and sort of develop this over time. So I think you've done an amazing amazing amount of work on top of your internship and postdoc to make this study work, and I really want to call that out. Thank you so much for coming and presenting it back to us. You know, many of us who were around as you were designing it are, you know, been really curious about the results. So this has been great. Just want to call out that the link for giving us feedback on today's talk is in your chat. We are really encouraging people to give us feedback. We're scientists, we like data. So please do give us your input. And again, to remember that on September 18th, we'll be coming back with our team from our Google study to present those results. So that'll be the third week of September. Thank you so much, Joe. I really appreciated it.
Thank you for having me. It was really wonderful to see everyone again.